Welcome to Demand Gen Confidential, the marketing podcast where we'll be talking with some of the most progressive marketers out there, diving deep into marketing tactics to help you become a better marketer. Let's jump into today's episode. I was mulling over what kind of conversation starters to roll with. I mean, we can obviously do the name thing, but I actually was thinking about just asking you about your time doing a PhD and what
Sure.
that is
Yeah.
like.
Yeah. I haven't talked in a while actually, but sure. We can start there.
Because I feel like science and data are such a big synonymous
Mm-hmm.
thing, or have one or the other. And a lot of times most marketers I've run into don't come from a science
Mm.
background. Like they didn't go to school and do science and then get their way into marketing or things
Mm-hmm.
like that. You see a lot of more like communication style things. So you'll see like communications, ethnic studies, poli-sci, things like that are a little creative brain
Mm.
versus, data brain. I
Yeah.
don't know which side of the brain is data and creative.
I always
I
mix
don't
up
even know.
left and right brain. But you know what? I really think that it's kind of an unfortunate misunderstanding that people think of those things as separate. I think science is incredibly creative. I think communications is science to some degree, and everybody's doing it in their heads all the time. At the root of it, science is just observation, it's structured observation, structured trial and error. And so I think that everybody has science inside them. And maybe that's not true. And I just think that because that's how my brain works. And so I'm assuming that everybody's brain works the same way. But I do think even people who say that they don't like math or they don't like science, I bet they do a little on the inside. Like everyone's a little curious, right?
Yeah, I read a book. I want to say it was a Malcolm Gladwell book, but I can't really remember the title now that I'm thinking about it. And they talked about kids doing math
Mm-hmm.
problems and how some people say, "Oh, I'm bad at math," or they'll say, "This kid's bad at math." And they actually found that nobody is actually bad at
Mm-hmm.
math. It's about who gives up first
Mm-hmm.
on the problem. So as long as you stick with it long enough, like the problem, it's about when you give up. And the people who give up earlier on the problem for all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
reasons tend to say that they're bad at math, but you just have to keep going down and learning
Yes.
that portion of it. So to your point, like anybody, I'm also in that camp. I'm not like you're this or that. Like you can learn
Mm-hmm.
anything. Like you can become more creative.
Totally.
Like, and science, like it's a lot of ideas. I mean, you have to have ideas to ask questions,
Exactly.
right? About the things that you see, and then you can go build a way to
Yeah,
measure it.
and that phenomenon is why I think it's a really unfortunate misunderstanding. Like for me personally, I always hated history. I think I had some bad history teachers growing up, and so I avoided
Mhm.
history at all costs all the way through my schooling. I took like the minimum amount of history. I took AP classes and everything else, and I took the easiest possible like remedial history classes, right? I just thought that I didn't like it. And the more that I thought that I didn't like it and that I was bad at it, the less exposure I gave myself to it. But then I
Yeah.
feel over the course of my adult life, as I now just learn for fun and I'll, learn history from like documentaries or like little YouTube videos or whatever. Now I'm like, oh, history is super interesting. Like I shouldn't have cut myself off by telling myself the story that I don't like history.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. But like, and history's interesting because a lot of it's
Mhm.
storytelling, I think. And if it's boring in just naming dates, then you can easily get
Yes.
disinterested. But if you think of like the story arcs of stuff and how almost everything is connected, like that's what I find fascinating about it is just like events don't typically happen isolated. Like they do, but there's a lot of times buildups to
Yeah.
things and things happen for a reason. And then that's like I find that when it
Yeah.
gets
And I
interesting.
think that's bringing it all the way back. I think that's very analogous to how people feel about math and science. Like if you had a
Yeah.
bad math or science teacher and they taught you that it's just about memorizing formulas or, chemical symbols, if that's what you think math and science is, it makes sense that you wouldn't like it. But then, like, once you cut yourself off from it, you're not going to learn enough to know that it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I apply now math wise to my job is it's not about like formulas, but it's like
Mhm.
figuring out how you should measure
Yeah.
something. And so there's a lot of problem solving, even to what should you even do
Yeah, exactly.
as far as like the formula, whether you're using Google Sheets or what have you to figure out the
Mm.
measurement of something in particular.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think to go all the way back to
But
the very first question you asked, which was about just like my time being a PhD, I kind of think of it as just a specific subset of data analysis. Like the reason I pivoted from biomedical engineering is what I was studying. The reason I pivoted from that to data analysis is because I didn't like some parts of that. So the wet lab part of it, the actual doing the experiments can be kind of tedious. And it's also pretty isolated as far as a job goes. Like a lot of your time on the job is spent by yourself setting up these experiments. But I really liked analyzing the data once I had it. So it was pretty much like, how can I take that skill set and apply it to another industry that's going to allow me to be more social during my job, and I won't have to do this annoying wet lab stuff anymore.
yeah, that's interesting. You had time in PhD in science. You've had some time in business. Like, what should people on the business side take from the scientific method and how they just approach their businesses that they could be a little more scientific?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And
Question.
I think I had an advantage of having two parents who were both physicists. So my whole
Mm.
upbringing, what like the scientific method comes so naturally to me because that's like how my family conducts conversations. So it like
Dinner table is
exactly. It
science.
just kind of, it not even science necessarily, but just that as the way of thinking about problems that you encounter in everyday life. And so I think not everybody has that luxury or thinks that way naturally, but I think that it's really helpful for business and for life, for anything that you encounter. Science is just a helpful framework for saying, like, okay, I observe this issue. Here are some patterns I observe about it. Here's how I can experiment with different ways of solving it. And then here's how I can figure out what worked and what didn't and do better the next time, is really all that it is. Right.
Yeah, and that's super interesting because particularly we'll take the data portion trying to apply it to marketing. Like marketing is it's a good framework for marketing because a lot of times you don't know what's going to
Mm-hmm.
work. And in today's profitability environment, a lot of us marketers spend all of our time on the measurement side just trying to prove worth.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't even get to the point of like trying to figure out what actually could make our work better or the marketing better, which is all like in that the whole point of the measurement is to try and get better, not necessarily just proving worth and all of that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think that's super
Yeah, I've
interesting.
been thinking about a similar thing recently. I feel like I've been reading a lot of discussion about proactive and reactive analytics, mostly within product
Interesting.
analytics, because that's what I do, right?
Yeah.
But the kind of the idea around these discussions is that a lot of companies get stuck in the trap of reactive analytics. Like maybe they have tracking set up, even, and they've got everything set up already, but they spend all of their analytics time trying to figure out like how much was this thing worth, like validate the thing, and what went wrong if something went wrong, right? Like they see a metric drop and they're like,
Mhm.
okay, let me investigate exactly why. Um, so that is the reactive analytics part of that. But then there's another proactive piece of analytics that I think every product analyst I've ever talked to wants to do more of, and it never feels like there's enough time for. And that's the like, how can I learn more about my customers and our product to uncover an insight that will make the thing more effective?
Yeah.
Right. And that is so powerful. And it's such a shame that nobody ever feels like they have time for it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's where you get the I mean in the kind of tech and Silicon Valley world, the aha
Mhm.
moments of this became our flywheel and it just started to print money for
Yeah,
us.
exactly.
I mean, it can come from the anecdotal, but you can also find it from the data portion
Yeah.
of it. So if you don't have enough time to even go search for those, that's an unfortunate
Yeah,
thing.
and I think it has to be
But
both too, right? Like it's And it's
Yeah.
possible, but it's difficult to find an insight just out of data without, any sort of qualitative input. And it's also risky to try to build a flywheel out of something where you have an intuition for it or like some, user research or something, but you haven't looked for any data. So I think you always need both.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, maybe we'll just do a quick introduction. So I'm here with Connie Wang, and she is a data guru. Since working with her at 99 Designs, I have told everybody that my time there working with Connie was my data science 101 because I thought that I knew a little bit about data until I met her. And so I wanted to sit down with her and talk about various data pitfalls and how we can do better with data. Because one of the things that in demand gen that is so important and in marketing is the data portion. And once you have data, everything becomes a little bit easier. If you know how to measure your paid ads, you know how to measure everything, life just becomes easier. And without it, life is extremely difficult. So one of the nice things also is that Connie doesn't just sit in marketing, so she can give us a broader perspective of how we should measure things. And I think that is a big advantage for us as we think about better data. So, Connie, is there anything else you would like the audience to know about you?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. Thanks for that quick introduction. Yeah, and I love that framing of data as something that makes life easier. I think that it can be kind of an intimidating word to some people, but ultimately, it's just something that makes what you're already thinking about a little simpler.
Awesome. Well, with that, we're just going to roll through a few of the pitfalls, and you had jotted down a few for me. And let's just kick it off with the first one of how do we decide what is a signal and what is noise? And for marketers listening, this is going to be different than intent signals, but I am going to ask a follow up question about that because I want to know Connie's data take on lead scoring and intent signals and how we should think about that. A little bit of a sidebar, but we're going to talk about how to do signals and noise. So, Connie, like, what's in this pitfall? Like, why do people forget what is important?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't realize that this was a confusing thing to call the pitfall because there's a marketing definition for signal. I mean, one of the things that's going to be fun about this conversation is I've been in product analytics for a couple of years now and don't have a ton of that marketing background. So, I'll be learning that as we go. But yeah, by signal and noise here, I mean the concept that started from electrical engineering, I think. But like when you're looking at sort of a waveform or a trend line, there's going to be natural fluctuations in it. And some of the fluctuations will tell you something that you care about, and some of the fluctuations are just randomness. So the problem here is how can we tell what changes we care about and how can we tell what's random? And I think the pitfall that I observe is really a lack of like defining a strategy. So people will define a metric that they want to watch. They'll figure out how they can monitor the metric, but they won't have done the work of thinking about how am I going to tell if I care about this movement and what will I do if this certain change happens in this metric. So the output of that or the problem that I see when that's the case is it falls into two camps. One is you become kind of disillusioned about your metric because it's changing so often that you ignore any change. You're like, okay, whatever this is, it's probably like external market factors. I don't care about it. And then the second is the opposite of that, where you're so sensitive to changes in it. You'll look at like the day over day metric and you'll be like, oh no, this metric is down 5% from yesterday. What happened? And then you spend all your time doing that reactive analytics, like we talked about, to try to figure
Yeah.
out what went wrong. So, yeah, that is the pitfall. Any questions?
So here's the thing that I like about this one is thinking about what you're going to do when it changes. And I don't think anybody, like, at least of all the marketers that I've worked with and salespeople and execs, nobody really knows what they're going to do if it goes down until it goes down, because I think we get excited about something and just assume it's going up and to the
Mm.
right. And so like we get excited about our brand new MQL scoring, our MQL definition. It's going to go up and to the right. And then it starts to go down. And we assume that it's a bad thing because it's going down, but there's all sorts of factors that could have it go down. And so I think that that's like a big part of just what are you going to do with the metric itself? Like, what actions can you possibly take? How do you think about deciding on that? If it's a signal or noise, what action should you possibly take or could take?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to depend a lot on what the metric is. So I think there's kind of two parts of this. Before you even get to what action am I going to take, you have to define when am I going to take action, right? And it can't just
Yeah,
be, I mean, I suppose it can. The what I wanted to get across with this pitfall, the solution to it, I think, is not about doing anything fancy data wise. It's about consistency and intentionality. So I suppose
got it.
technically you can say I will react anytime this is negative, but you're going to be reacting a lot. So I wouldn't advise it. There's like a sensitivity that you have to tailor there. But yeah, I think let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's talk about, first let me figure out when I'm going to do anything at all. But I do think you're right that it's so tempting. I think it might be like cultural, it might be a part of American culture to not want to think about when the metric goes down and just assume it's going to go up to the right. Like it almost feels like jinxing it by talking about what you're going to do
Yeah.
if it goes down. But jinxes aren't real. So,
Okay, well, that's good to
yeah.
know. Now, one of the other things, so like thinking of signal and noise. So one of the things that I always run into is, and I'm going to fixate a little bit on, well, I'm going to fixate on two metrics that we do a lot in marketing, and that's MQLs, market qualified leads, and opportunity pipeline. And two of the things that happen, especially if you're scaling fast or growing, so like you're 10 million to 50 million is your kind of like roadmap, you're going to change those metrics all
Mm.
the time. And I don't know if anybody can contain themselves and not change them. And so then what ends up happening is we start looking at, so the change can come in, MQL, you're looking at demo requests, and then you start adding, people who engage so that you can pump that number up. That's a trend that's going away, but people still do it. And then the other is like in a, an opportunity, like what does sales consider pipeline? And they have subjective criteria that they're changing to optimize. And so then we're looking at metrics over time, and it'll be quarter over quarter, it'll be year over year, and then we start making all these assumptions. What ends up happening if you're trying to decide signal from noise, if you're just changing your metrics all the
Yeah,
time?
that's a really, really good question. I think you have to be
Or
clear.
changing the criteria of the metrics, I
Right.
should say.
I think you have to be clear which metrics are stable and which metrics are changing. So for something like that, where you're changing the criteria of your lead score, any metrics downstream of that are going to change based on your criteria. So you're changing the definition of what like a qualified lead is, and then you're measuring what percentage of qualified leads convert. Obviously, that's a metric that will not be stable to your changes, but there may be other metrics that will be stable to your changes, like maybe your overall conversion rate, just like of anyone who enters the funnel, how many of them convert. That shouldn't change based
Yeah.
on your lead score definition. So the reason why that distinction is important is you can use a stable metric like that to track the performance of your like modifications of the score over time. So as you modify,
Yeah.
that's kind of like your source of truth metric to see how you go. But then your unstable metrics like conversion rate of qualified leads, every time you change your criteria for what a lead is, that is now a new metric. So you only have as much historical data since the last time you changed it, right? So it could be you're changing it so often that's not a useful measure for you at all, right?
It's almost like you'd have to take, so one of the problems that people do, and you might have to roll your eyes at us marketers and things that we do, but we'll take an MQL definition or an approved opportunity definition and stuff a whole bunch of criteria
Mhm.
into it. So it'll be like a demo request, a webinar registration, a white paper download, if you meet these criteria, and then we'll stuff it all in to be this one overarching metric, and then not knowing which of these things are actually, driving the increase per se. And then we say like, okay, well, white paper downloads don't convert at all, so we're going to drop that out, and then our MQL definition drops. You almost like have to take each individual thing as its own metric, not the overarching thing that you've put a whole bunch of criteria in that you're then going to start changing. So to your like stable metrics thing, that might have to be what you end up doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a use case for both,
I don't know.
I think, right? Like, I can
Okay.
see the usefulness of having one overarching score that includes all of these different types of customers. But like you said, it's going to be harder to interpret how that moves. Where if you have a really simple metric, that makes interpretation simple. So I think I wouldn't say it's always a problem to have like a really complicated lead score or a really complicated metric, as long as it's
Okay.
paired with that sort of segmentation or like these more specific metrics. But I do think there's like another like parallel pitfall or another related
Okay.
pitfall here of just this idea of quantity over quality. Like it feels as though some people think the more I shove into this metric or the more metrics I look at, the better. And that is
Mhm.
obviously not true.
Why isn't it true?
Well, so part of the reason is that interpretability issue that I talked about. I think that is a main reason, but there's also just no reason for it to be true. It's kind of a fallacy in itself, like the product of not thinking hard enough about it to think that more is better, right? Like, why would more be better?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to get to that because we will get to that, but I want to talk about this intense piece because so the pitfall is knowing whether a signal is accurate or not. And I actually think there is a parallel to these signals because one of the big trends that we have is everybody wants to know if a buyer's intent is there in order to buy, so that we're not wasting time
Mm.
on people who aren't in market. And so we take all sorts of intent signals, and there's all sorts of providers out there. They provide third parties. So like if you're, Connie, you're searching for, I, I don't know, Apple computer, that'll say like, okay, you're in market. So there's all sorts of third party stuff like that. And then there's all of your internal stuff as well. So you download and engage on website. And then we're meshing all of this together. And one of the things I think, and then we decide this person's in market or not in market. And it's taking all of those signals, kind of like the MQL thing, and figuring out what is the right thing to be looking at. And like from a data perspective, like we talked about science and having to measure all of this stuff, and then you ultimately, I think when you run an experiment, determine what has significance in something. I don't have a good science example. Maybe you do of doing this. But the ultimate question is like, how should we decide what signals to keep? Because a lot of times we think more is better, and what we should just take away and focus on, maybe two. Maybe it's only two that we need versus
Yeah.
50.
I mean,
Like in that whole
having
thing.
never been a marketer
And this might be an
myself,
experimentation
I may
thing.
be completely off base here, but my instinct is to start small and work your way up. So instead of starting with a metric that has like 5 billion things in it, start with just a
Okay.
few criteria and see how that works. And then add the criteria one at a time, see if it improves it or not. Maybe it doesn't improve it, take it out. So that's one approach. There's also, of course, the qualitative approach. I mean, I hear people say all the
Mm.
time that marketing is more art than science, which again, I think is unfair because science is artistic. But yeah, there's like not everything can be measured. And even if it can be measured, you might not be looking at the right metrics to measure it. Right. So intuition is important.
Oh,
And I don't want to, I'm not saying only look at data, don't use intuition. Of course not. That is really important. And then there's like actual analytics approaches you can use. And the two camps of that are like backward facing and forward facing. So you can look at your historical data and collect like these are all
mhm.
of the customers that have come into our funnel in the last year. These are the ones who converted. Of the ones who were converted, what are they like? What other traits does that correlate to? And then you can try to build up your lead score based off of like, oh, I've observed that somebody who has this engagement is super likely to convert. Somebody who adds a product to their cart is, 5 million times more likely to convert than someone who doesn't. Of course,
Yeah.
the downfall of that is that's all correlational data, right? So by using that as
Mm.
your lead score, you're assuming that all of those links are causative, which, they may not be. So that's part of where the intuition comes in as well. Like you can use your intuition to determine,
Gotcha.
okay, I see there's a really strong link between these two. Does it make sense for it to be a causation link? Or does it not make sense? In which case, it's probably just correlation. And then the other camp of analysis you can do is forward facing. And that's more like the experimentation type things, which will tell you about
Got it.
causation and not just about correlation.
Got it. So so historical is only going to tell you correlation, and you have to actually then go test it in order to say that this actually
Yes.
is the
Yeah. And there's
reason.
all kinds of fancy things that people do to try to pull causation data out of historical data or out of things that aren't really tests. And they are just never going to be as accurate as real tests. There's like a variety of different estimates about how accurate that kind of thing is. And the range is really wide, but overall, it's kind of like a better than nothing, you know? And as a marketer, somebody who
Got
doesn't
it.
have a ton of analytics background or tooling, it's not worth worrying about. Like, it's going to be easier for you to just think to yourself, okay, if it's historical data, it's always correlational.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So then two things on that I want to go into. So the testing piece. So one of the issues that depending on the type of company you have, like B2C companies or, with a lot of data have it really easy, but if you don't have that much data to go in and test, like how would you start to approach that portion?
Yeah, I think there is no amount of data that is too small to test. Even if you are like manually
Okay.
calling customers and you have like 10 customers to call, you can still A B test that. You can only call half of them if you want to, right? The difference between a test
Okay.
that has a lot of data points in it and a test that has a very small sample is that you get a tighter confidence band when you have more data. So at the end, you are more
Mhm.
sure of your results. And there's no way around that. If you
Got it.
don't have enough data to be very confident in your findings, then you just don't. But the way that you kind of overcome that, or the way that you can think about it, is that the less data you have, the weaker the piece of evidence is. Like if we're in court and I'm presenting evidence to show my case,
Mhm.
if I'm only calling 10 people, it's not very strong evidence. So that means I would have to pair it with other pieces of evidence, like my own intuition or like user interviews or whatever, versus if I had 20,000 people and I found that this one group performed better in like a randomized A B test, I would feel pretty sure of that by itself. I wouldn't need to rely on other evidence as much.
Interesting. So one of the problems I think marketers tend to fall into, and I've fallen into this camp, is that in that 10 customer example, the data gets discounted. Like the whole thing is discounted. Like there's just not enough for
Mm.
us to like we're just going to discount it altogether. But ultimately what you should probably do if you're in that camp is preface that the confidence isn't that high. So we've got other things anecdotally or otherwise that we're pairing with this. So there's data and these other evidence things. And from a statistical perspective, that is valid. Or like you would say, like that approach would be
Yeah,
valid and people should.
yes, for sure. And from a statistical
Accept it.
perspective, that, or like, I always like to say statistics is just like making it simple. It's taking your intuitive thing that you already know and make it simple. So what I just said about being less sure of the outcome with sample size, you would see that statistically because you would plug it into like an A/B test
Okay.
calculator and it would say the results are not significant. Or some A/B test calculators will give you a confidence interval. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have any off the top of my head, but definitely seek out an A/B test calculator that will give you a confidence interval and not just a yes no. And if you do that with a small sample size, it'll give you a confidence interval that's like this change resulted in anywhere from minus 15 to plus 40% lift, right? Which is super wide. not
Yeah.
very sure of the outcome. But in that case, more on the positive side than the negative side. So if you have a lot of other evidence that indicates that your treatment is a good thing, this adds to it. If you have a lot of evidence that indicates that your treatment is a bad thing, this does not override that evidence. you know?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And a lot of times I think it comes in like when you don't have that and you're trying to convince people, if it's like some kind of contrarian take, almost is like where people, if it's something people already instinctively think, then it's probably a lot
Yeah.
easier. But that's all of the human side of
Yeah,
stuff.
true.
The other thing that we fall into a lot is just not A/B testing, or just taking the assumption we're just not going to test because it's there's a thing in marketing a lot of times where it's like not everything has to be tested, and while that's true, you know like what would your take be, like, not to put you on the hot seat, but like what would your take be if it's like not everything should be tested? And sometimes I think it just comes from people don't want to go through the effort, like all of this stuff. Like, when should you test or not, do you
Yeah,
think?
this is really contentious in product as well. So this is definitely not just limited to marketing. And it is
Yeah.
so
Okay.
subjective. Like thinking of things that are more an art than a science, when to test and when to not test, super subjective. But yeah, I agree that not everything needs to be tested. I think you just have to ask yourself, what are the reasons that you're not testing? A really common one I see is like, oh, we just don't have the sample size. And I don't
Mm,
think that's always a good reason to not test. Like if your sample is so small that you think the outcome won't matter at all, like it will not help you at all, then don't test. But also if your sample is small, the cost of testing is lower, right? Like every time you run a test, you do incur the cost of like, well, if this thing actually is really good, I could have just rolled it out and immediately gotten 100% of the benefit. But instead, I'm only getting 50% of the benefit for the 2 weeks while I'm running this test. Right. So there is a
yeah.
cost to think about, and that factors into do I want to test or not? There's also
Hmm.
always kind of like a strategic ploy, like sometimes it's not worth testing because it fits into wider company strategy. And so, like, we need this in order to do this other thing or in order to be part of this larger
Yeah.
program. Sometimes it's not worth testing because we don't have the right metric to measure the outcome.
Yeah.
So, like, if it is something that we don't think is going to improve conversion, but we do think is going to improve customer experience by a lot, maybe we don't test it. Though, a lot of times in product, we do test that kind of thing, but only to make sure it doesn't
Yeah.
hurt conversion rate. So, but anyway, there's various good reasons to not test. I think probably the most, if I were going to simplify it, the most important things to consider for your decision whether to test or not are how big is the risk and how big is the cost of testing, right? So
Hmm.
if it's something that is really risky, maybe it's worth it regardless of the cost, or vice versa. If it's something that is not very risky, then it may not be worth testing just because it is too costly to test. And one of the things that factors, I guess this is the second part that I was going to say, but it kind of factors into how risky is the decision is how easy is the decision to reverse, right? Is this a two-way door or
Hmm.
is it a one-way door as
Yeah.
the buzzwords like to go? And if it's a two-way door, maybe that's another one where you're like, I'm not going to test it. I think this is good. Worst case scenario, our metrics tank. I'll just roll it back.
Yeah. That's I think yeah, that's a lot of good advice. And I think the big thing is just knowing why you're going to test or
Yes.
not. Like, rather than just saying not everything's testable, we're not going to test
Yes.
this, but having a specific reason why. And it doesn't have to be probably super complicated,
Yeah,
but just acknowledging, like, we were going to do this anyway, so like
exactly. And then
let's
I
just not
I
waste our
also want to list
time.
some bad reasons that I've seen not to test. I listed some good
Okay.
reasons not to
Yeah.
test, some bad reasons not to test that I've seen. A, we don't have enough data, as I already mentioned. B, I
Yeah.
just feel really strongly about this. Like, I have a strong opinion. I don't have any user research to back it up. I don't have like survey feedback or anything. I just think this is good. Not a good reason not to test. You need a better reason than that. And
Okay.
then the third one is I'm in a rush. I think you're never too much in a rush not to test. Like maybe there are other reasons around that, but if it's just a perception that you're in a rest. Testing doesn't take that long. Like you don't always have to
Yeah.
run a test for the same amount of time either. You can say, oh, I'll only run the test for a week and have a lower level of confidence, but it's still worth running that test.
Yeah, I've seen where the rush one is interesting because we don't have the time, we're moving too fast, and then 2 months later is by the time you actually get the thing launched. So
Exactly.
like you are in like now 2 months might be a rush for some organizations. 2 months might be an eternity for others. And so, but I'm in the camp of 2 months is an eternity, and like so you're rushing not test like that
And
seems yeah super
there's
valid.
often an easier way to run the test. Like you don't always have to test the full feature. And there's other types of tests
Mhm.
besides A/B tests that you can do as well. So it could be that by testing kind of a watered down version of the thing and then finding it doesn't work, you've now saved yourself 2 months of working on a thing that doesn't have an impact.
That's also a big pitfall. So a lot of times in marketing, we'll say like we have this grand campaign, we're going to invest, you know, a month to get this thing launched, and we didn't do a small piece of it to even determine if this was going to
Mm.
hit, and then it doesn't hit, and then we're like, wow, like, and that ultimately that buries a lot of marketers because they go strictly on
Yeah.
gut and don't do a small piece, see if there's some kind of response,
Yeah, totally.
and then should we double down on
Yeah,
it?
I think that's a really, I mean, we're like so far down a tangent at this point now, but I think that that is one of the reasons why, in talking about how to differentiate signal from noise, I really wanted to stress that it doesn't have to be fancy. Like there are fancy ways to
Yeah.
try to pull out real trends out of a noisy trend line, but you don't have to use any of them. Like even if you're somebody who says, like, I don't like data, I'm not good at data, I have no experience, really the only thing you have to do is figure out what metric you want to track and then figure out when you care, whether that's like, oh, it's, more than one standard deviation away, which is really easy to calculate these days with like Google Sheets. Just put an
Yeah.
hour into it. And the reason I bring that up is because I think a lot of those people who just operate by gut, they almost do it out of fear. They just like haven't tried using data before. And so they're like too intimidated to do the thing. And that's why they're operating by gut. But as soon as you show those people that it's easy, they're fine. They like use it from then on going forward. It's not that they don't like it.
Yeah, I mean accessibility is a big factor for a lot of
Yeah.
things. Yeah, we did get down the rabbit hole, but that's okay. The whole point of this particular show is to get down rabbit holes so that people have deep technical stuff that they can go in and actually do better with their
That's
job.
because I'm very prone to going down rabbit holes and losing the plot.
Yeah, there's plenty of people talking high level strategy, but in the weeds is where we want to be. But that being said, I do want to. So we've talked about signals and noise. Like, how do we actually decide which metrics we're going to use?
Yes.
And you mentioned to me, and I'm gonna. You mentioned to me talking about out of the box stuff and whether it applies. I'm just going to say my opinion on out of the box is, and you can disagree or not, is it's for amateurs. It's for getting started. But once you get past that level, you can start to do your own custom stuff. And one of the out of the box things that we do a lot in marketing is, especially in SaaS, is we all have to have MQL, SAL, SQL, op stage 1 through 5 in one when there's like 3 metrics that matter. The first, getting into your system, when the sales team does stuff, and then revenue. And so, like, with that, like, understanding the landscape is a lot of out of the box metrics that all marketers are using. Like, how do we decide?
Yeah, I like that take a lot. Yeah, this was pitfall number 2 was not thinking hard enough about your metrics. And I think the reason why, like where my brain goes when you say out of the box metrics are for amateurs, the reason why that's true to me is that as an amateur, you don't have a good enough understanding of any metrics to even know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So it's useful to look at those out of the box metrics and use that to sort of understand the landscape a little bit more. But in order to actually build an understanding from that and not just rely on the out of the box metrics forever, you have to know what those metrics mean. You have to be thinking really hard about what the metrics mean and not just taking it for granted that, like, oh, this means whatever my fuzzy mental interpretation of it is. And the example that I gave for this is conversion rate. I think conversion rate is like the most widely used, badly defined metric. Everybody has something different in mind when they say conversion rate. Like,
Yeah.
are you thinking as a percentage of users? Are you thinking as a percentage of visits? Do you have a conversion window in mind? Are you like, okay, of the customers who land today, how many of them convert in 2 weeks? Or are you just taking the number of orders that day divided by the number of visitors that day? Like, there's so many different ways to define conversion rate. And I find that because it's so widely used, people think that they know what it means and they just don't think about it. And that's such a mistake because if you're looking at the trends in that, the interpretation is going to be very different depending on exactly how you define the metric. So I think that applies for all of the marketing metrics that you said that I actually don't know what any of them mean. But I'm sure there's a
It's okay.
yeah,
One, me too.
I'm sure there's a way in the tool to like click a button to show you the definition. And you should definitely do that. You should understand what the definition is. And then when that metric changes, especially when it changes in a way that you're surprised by, it'll be much easier to further investigate. Like if it's a rate, you'll want to see how is the numerator moving, how's the denominator moving. So if I'm looking at conversion rate and I know that it is the percentage of customers, of all the customers who visited today or who visited 2 weeks ago, how many of them made a purchase in the following 2 weeks? If that is the metric, then I know to investigate how many customers are visiting and then how many customers are purchasing, right, with that 2 week window. So that's the way that you build the understanding of the metric. And then once you have that, you know more about how the numbers work. So you can say, okay, actually, I'm not interested in this. What I want to see is this slightly different version where I only care about this segment of customers, or I only care about like a 3 day conversion window and not a 10-day conversion window, right? Things like that.
The conversion rate thing is super interesting. And I love that that's your example because too often I have run into conversion rates down or conversion rates improving. And it's this like, well, what is the conversion rate? And the way that we're measuring it, can you actually control it? Because a lot of times we'll look at it and there'll be so many things in between that it could be any one of these benchmarking things that are happening. So I'll give an example like, so MQL to, approved opportunity for sales teams. Like that conversion rate is down. But what's in there is all of the MQL criteria, and did you change it or not? Then you have like all the next actions, and the next actions are, did a salesperson follow up and put time on the calendar? Did they show up to the time on the calendar? Did that calendar meeting go well? Did they follow up after that calendar? Did they schedule the next meeting with the account executive? And then did they have a demo? And then did it get approved? Like, I don't know how many I, signaled off there, but like 10 steps in between that conversion rate. And so to your point of like the definition, like, would you even look at a conversion rate that wide?
Yeah. So I think there's like a lot of different reasons that one might want to track metrics. And I think there is a place for looking at a conversion rate that wide. That can be a good like alerting signal or a good indication that any of your small conversion rates is actually important. Because I guess on the opposite extreme of that, like I've broken everything down into very granular metrics and now I'm reacting to each one of those separately. So maybe I'm like, okay, what's the conversion rate between someone entering the funnel and scheduling a sales call? That conversion rate going down, maybe that's not a bad thing. Like maybe we just pumped the funnel full of more people. And so we are actually scheduling more sales calls. It's just the conversion rate is going down, right? So at the end of the day, the conversion rate that matters is the big one, not any of the small ones, right?
Okay.
So I definitely think it's valuable to look at least in conjunction with the smaller ones. But yeah, you also bring up a really good point that each granular metric is also important to look at least at specific points in time. Like I tracking all of them all the time might just be too much. Like the more metrics you
Yeah.
track, the higher your likelihood of seeing like a false pattern and then having to waste your time, chasing it down. So maybe they're not as good of tracking metrics, but they're much better in the instance where I'm like testing a change or something like that. I've applied a change and I want to see what the impact is. I may not see that impact on the overall metric, but maybe I have a hypothesis that like me treating the sales call differently makes it more likely that the customer will schedule a follow up or something like that, right? In order to validate whether that hypothesis is true, I do want to look at that very granular metric. That's the place where where I'm most likely to see that change. And then I want to see, okay, like let's assume that it is true. Great. It makes it more likely to schedule a follow up. Maybe I see there is no impact on downstream conversion. That's a learning as well, right? Like my hypothesis was right that this makes it them more likely to schedule a follow up, but ultimately it didn't do the
Mhm.
business any good because they, dropped out at a later point in the funnel. So do I need to go somewhere later in the funnel and treat how I'm handling that? Was it actually a bad idea in the first place because I'm kind of just leading customers on for a little bit longer without actually making any impact?
Interesting. So I guess the summary on that is take the larger metric. If it moves in a direction you don't want, then you dive in and figure out what all those stages are. But you probably should know what all of those individual pieces are at the get go. So then you can go back and take a look at it. If it moves in a direction that is alarming to your signals and noise point, that, it's a signal, it's moved. Now we need to go digest or, dive in and figure out what's
Yeah,
happening.
I think the through line is really choose your metrics wisely. Like, don't just have your
Yeah.
dashboard of metrics. Really think about what am I trying to do? I'm trying to set up an alerting system for if something goes wrong, or like I'm trying to measure the impact of a change. Start from there and then choose the smallest set of metrics that will cover your use case.
Okay. Okay. And that kind of is the last portion is just quantity over quality on metrics of like what, I don't even know what did I jot down as our question. Okay, so how many metrics do you actually need?
Yeah, this definitely
And
fits into
that's
that.
kind of and like how many metrics do you think people need?
Oh man, I definitely can't give an absolute number. I think that, I mean, it's like we were talking about before. The problem is with the thought that quantity matters over quality. Maybe you work
Yeah.
in a really complex space where you do need a lot of metrics, but that means you're going to have to spend a lot more time looking at them too, which for
Yeah.
me, that's the key reason why I tell people to simplify it because the more like metrics tracking is reactive analytics. So the more
Okay.
metrics that you set, the more time you're going to have to spend looking at them and understanding them, the less time you have for proactive analytics to, proactively uncover those insights to move you in the next direction.
And when we work together, you like when I come to you for, analytic stuff, you'd always tell me what's a question you want to answer. And is that kind of how you should think about proactive analytics? Is like you have a question about the business or something, or are you thinking about it as just diving in and figuring out
Yeah, I think that's
different.
actually the question you should ask for all analytics, reactive analytics, proactive analytics. You should always start with
Okay.
just what question am I trying to answer and use that to decide what metrics to look at. But yeah, for proactive analytics too, I think it always works best when you have a hypothesis in mind already. Like, oh, based on what I know about this product, I feel like there's this segment of customers who we probably appeal a lot to, and that can be your starting point for then saying, how do I see this segment of customers? Like what are the things that they all do so that I can identify them in our data? And then is it true
Yeah.
that they're really high converting or is that a false assumption?
Yeah. Okay. So don't just have metrics for metrics sake. And the more you have, the more work you got to do
Yeah.
digesting. That's good. I mean, do you have any other concluding advice for marketers, novice data practitioners, other pitfalls you want to cover
Yeah.
as,
I think the only thing we didn't get
I feel
to
like this.
that was a piece of advice I wanted to give was the idea of thinking backwards. This goes back to, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit already with the, start with what decision you're going to make based on your metric to help you determine what metrics to track. And it's really just that. So if I am trying to figure out what metrics to look at, what I want to know is the type of decision that I want to take. Ultimately, I'm
Okay.
like, okay, why am I tracking metrics, right? Do I want to, prevent myself from doing a bad sales pitch? I don't know anything about marketing.
Yeah.
But there's some decision that you're trying to make, whether it's a daily decision or a one-off decision, there's something that you're trying to know. And that's the whole reason you're looking at metrics in the first place. So then you can start to think, okay, if I knew X, I would make this kind of decision. So
Okay.
maybe I operate on mobile and desktop, and I'm trying to think if I want to do like focus more of my time on mobile. Say, okay, well, how do I know whether I want to focus more of my time on mobile? Maybe like this certain type of customer, I can see how well they convert on mobile and how well they convert on desktop. And one of the things that I hypothetically could find is that mobile performs worse for this type of customer and unexpectedly. So then the action that
Yeah.
I would take is I would do this with mobile customers. All right, so now I know I need to go find that piece of information. Like, what is this conversion rate on mobile? What is it on desktop? And that's how I've identified the metric. I didn't just start with my panel of metrics and trying to pull out like any insight that I can from that. I'm actually starting from the decision and working backwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like if you're going to choose a metric, like you have to be, well, the way I'm thinking in digesting this is you have to be able to take an action if you're going to have it. Like it almost goes back to some of the other stuff that we were talking about in that if it goes up or down, like, what are you going to do about
Mm-hmm.
it? And, all of that. And so thinking about that, you had mentioned at one point, we were talking like thinking about those metrics and it's, what's the next logical, like choosing one and then the next logical action that somebody could take for the next downstream metric. And then, the overall business,
Oh,
like what
yes.
they
Yeah. Yeah. The
look
last time we were
at.
talking about it,
I think this kind of fits in that.
yeah, I was kind of thinking about what the minimum set of metrics is. And I always like to advocate for minimalism. So, what is the smallest set of metrics that one could possibly look at? And I think that that smallest set of metrics is two. There's one metric, you need at least one to tell you about the overall state of the business. So, in the
Hmm.
minimal set, you have one just like overall conversion or like revenue, some really high level metric. And then the second metric that you absolutely need is the closest to whatever you're changing. So, whatever your action that you take on a day to day is, what is the immediate next step? If I'm making sales pitches to people all day and my end
Yeah.
goal of that pitch is I want them to sign up for a free trial, then that next step metric is what percentage of the people that I'm talking to sign up for a free trial. And then maybe there's like a whole bunch of other steps before they get to conversion. I don't need to track each of those steps individually necessarily. I at least don't need to look at them all the time. But I do want to know how many of them get to that last step of conversion because like
Yeah.
we'd already mentioned, if I do a really good job bringing customers to the next step and it's not going all the way through, something needs to change, right?
Yeah. That's good.
I think the quality versus quantity thing, um, in order to not be too much of a Scrooge, I do want to say like it is nice that people like to go quantity over quality. I think a lot of times it comes to a place from a place of curiosity, which I think is really important, regardless of what job you're doing. I think it's so important to be curious. And so a lot of times when I see this, it's people who are really excited about data, who are like, I want to know this and this and this. And they want to understand their customer. And I think that's great. So I'm not trying to like poo
Yeah.
poo that
Okay.
attitude. It's just not the most pragmatic way of approaching data. And it takes a really long time. So, as sort of a simplifying, this advice is to save you some time and simplify your approach to data so that you can do other things. But the natural drive to want to look at 50 million metrics, like that's not a bad thing. I'm happy that exists.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the advice there is stay curious in that, but it doesn't have to translate in big analytics dashboards. There's a lot of ways to stay curious and ask questions about the customer or about your business, about what's going to drive improvement, which ultimately is your scientific method, coming
Yeah,
back and asking, your observations and just, generally being curious about what's happening around you.
exactly. Now, as somebody who naturally likes to go down useless rabbit holes myself, I will time box it. So I'll just say, like, I think this is interesting and I think it could be useful. There's always a chance that you find something really useful and actionable when you do that. But I'll just give myself 2 hours for it and then go back to the thing that I actually need to get done.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting curious, like I find myself in those rabbit holes as well, very regularly. But I think it comes like, hopefully, I'm, maybe thinking too highly of myself, but it comes from
Yeah,
curiosity of like what's going to drive improvement or hunting to get the bad stuff out, if you
totally. And
will.
especially when you work in like that's so important, right? It's vital.
Yeah. Any other concluding advice for people to, get started, being curious, using data,
Yeah.
making it accessible?
Yeah, I would say just keep it simple. Like, especially for people who are like getting started or who don't feel confident with data yet, just keep it really simple. Don't let the tools that people are trying to sell you convince you that you need something really fancy or you need a lot of knowledge or whatever. You can get a lot done with just intentionality. So,
Okay. Well, thank you, Connie. I appreciate taking the time and chatting through data. These are great pitfalls to try to avoid. We did get down a rabbit hole, which is
yeah,
good to kick this whole thing off. Where would you like people to connect with you?
you can find me on LinkedIn.
All right. That's the
Yep.
place. That is where all of our professional work
Yeah,
goes.
exactly. And I love talking about this stuff. I especially love like encouraging people to step outside their comfort zone a little bit with that on. So yeah, hit me up. I'd love to chat.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you, Connie, and enjoy the rest of your
You
day.
too. See you later.